They called it the Valorum Accord. 712 years of interstellar negotiation, compressed into a single document that was, by all measurable standards, the most sophisticated piece of political engineering the galaxy had ever produced. 43 civilizations had contributed to its drafting. 17 had cried during the signing ceremony, and yes, some of those species could actually cry, which made the whole thing rather touching, or so I am told. My name is Vethrak Ozuun, Senior Diplomatic Observer for the Conclave of Sion, and I was there the day humanity walked into the Grand Deliberation Hall on Station Valoris Prime, and very politely, very calmly, and with absolutely no prior warning, dismantled everything. I want to be clear about something before I continue. I have spent 400 years studying diplomacy. I have watched the Drivari negotiate a ceasefire, while simultaneously insulting every single delegate at the table, in 3 languages. I have watched the Philosi submit a counteroffer written entirely in interpretive movement, which took 11 hours to fully present and still somehow resulted in a trade deal. I thought I had seen everything. I had not seen humans. To understand what happened, you need to understand the Valorum Accord itself. The Accord was not just a peace treaty. It was a living framework, a set of laws, obligations, resource-sharing commitments, and mutual defense clauses that governed the behavior of nearly half the known galaxy. It had taken 7 centuries to build because diplomacy, at the interstellar level, is not fast. You cannot rush a species that experiences time differently, or a civilization whose consensus process requires every adult member to submit a formal opinion, or a government whose head of state is a committee of 40 rotating minds that can never fully agree on lunch, let alone foreign policy. The Accord worked because everyone had agreed to play by the same rules. You submit grievances through designated channels, you wait for review cycles, you attend mandatory mediation sessions, you fill out the forms, and there are so many forms, and you trust that the process, slow and maddening as it is, will eventually produce a result. Humanity had been a provisional member of the Accord for 60 years. They joined late, as they tend to do with most things, having spent a significant portion of their early spacefaring era getting into conflicts they probably could have avoided and then resolving them in ways that confused everyone watching. But they had signed the documents. They had attended the orientation seminars. They had even, and this still impresses me, managed to sit through the Dravari's 40-hour welcome ceremony without a single incident. So when the human delegation arrived at the emergency session of the Galactic Council, called to address the ongoing territorial dispute in the Kethis corridor, we all assumed they were there to participate in the normal diplomatic process. The delegation was led by a woman named Portia Wren. She was a compact, unhurried sort of person, with the particular quality of stillness that I have come to associate with humans who are about to do something irreversible. Beside her stood a man named Babatunde Osei, the Deputy Secretary for External Affairs, who had the expression of someone who had already read the ending of a book everyone else was still on page 12 of. Their legal counsel was a young woman named Reiko Tanaka, who carried a data case approximately the size of a small geological formation, and behind them were 2 advisors whose names I did not catch at the time, though I would learn them later. Fen Calloway, a soft-spoken analyst with the habit of writing things down even when recording devices were present, and Drago Vasic, who was technically listed as security, but spent the entire session reading something on a handheld device that was definitely not a threat assessment. The council hall on Valoris Prime is, architecturally speaking, designed to make you feel small. The ceilings are 40 meters high, the deliberation floor is a perfect circle, ringed by tiered observation galleries, and the acoustics are engineered so that every voice carries equally to every point in the room. It is a space built for gravitas, and it usually achieves it. Portia Wren walked in like she was going to a meeting. She had already decided to leave early. The session opened in the traditional manner. Grand Arbiter Thelok Van, a Cephali of considerable age and considerably more patience, recited the formal invocation of the Accord's mediating principles. This takes approximately 20 minutes. Most delegations stand quietly. The Drivari delegation, as they always do, hummed softly at specific intervals in what I believe is a gesture of cultural respect, though it sounds like a malfunctioning air recycler. The human delegation stood. Portia Wren looked at the ceiling once, then did not look at it again. When Thelok Van finished and the floor was opened for preliminary statements, the Kethis Corridor dispute was formally introduced. For those unfamiliar, the Kethis Corridor is a navigational passage of significant strategic value, running between 4 systems that are each claimed in whole or in part by different member civilizations of the Accord. The dispute had been ongoing for 11 years. There had been 46 formal mediation sessions. There had been a provisional agreement, 3 counter-provisional agreements, 2 retracted counter-provisional agreements, and 1 incident that required its own mediation process to resolve. The Accord's standard timeline projected another 4 to 7 years before a binding resolution could be achieved. Vethrak Ozuun noted all of this for the record. He expressed confidence in the process. He invited opening statements. Portia Wren raised her hand. Vethrak Ozuun, who had not been interrupted during an opening in 300 years of service, paused. He looked at her. He said, with careful formality, that opening statements would proceed in the established order, and that the human delegation was, as a provisional member, scheduled to speak forth. Portia Wren said, with equal formality and absolutely no change in expression, that she understood, and that she would like to note for the record that the human delegation intended to withdraw from the Valorum Accord at the conclusion of the session. The room did not go silent. A room containing 43 delegations of different species, some of which communicate through sound frequencies outside standard ranges, with environmental systems running, ambient translation equipment active, and the low constant hum of Valoris Prime's orbital stabilizers operating in the background, cannot truly go silent. But it went as close to silent as it was physically capable of going, and what remained in that near silence was something that felt, very strongly, like the galaxy holding its breath. Vethrak Ozuun, to his enormous credit, did not visibly panic. He said, in a measured tone, that he wanted to ensure he had understood correctly. Portia Wren said that yes, he had understood correctly, and she was happy to clarify if needed. He said he would appreciate clarification. She opened a document, a physical document, printed on actual paper, which you must understand is a choice that humans make with full awareness of the statement it projects, and she began to read. I have since obtained the full text of what she read. It was 47 pages long. In the session, she read a summary, which took approximately 18 minutes, but those 18 minutes were among the most consequential I have witnessed in 4 centuries of observation. Because what Portia Wren read was not an emotional complaint, or a political grievance, or a threat. It was an audit. Humanity had spent 3 years, apparently, reviewing the Valorum Accord not as a political document, but as an operational system. They had tracked every mediation session across the Accord's history, every resolution timeline, every instance where a binding decision had been delayed, superseded, reopened, or overturned. They had mapped the gap between the Accord's stated principles and its actual outcomes. They had calculated, with the kind of methodical patience that is genuinely terrifying when you encounter it outside of a laboratory setting, exactly how often the Accord's process had produced a result that any of its founding principles would have recognized as just, timely, or functional. The numbers were not good. I will not repeat all of them. But I will tell you that when Portia Wren reached the section on the Kethis Corridor specifically, 11 years, 46 sessions, 0 binding resolutions, and a projected 4 to 7 additional years, Babatunde Ose, standing just behind her right shoulder, did something that I later came to understand was a very specific kind of human expression. He pressed his lips together and looked at a point approximately 2 meters above Vethrak Ozuun's head, and his expression said, without any words at all, yes, we know, we were also surprised. Portia Wren concluded her summary by noting that the human delegation had, under Article 77 of the Accord, the legal right to withdraw with a 90-day notice period, and that the notice was hereby formally submitted. She also noted, and this is the part that made Fen Calloway stop writing and look up, which told me even the human team had not been entirely sure she was going to say it, that the human delegation was prepared to share its full audit with any member civilization that requested it, free of charge, with no conditions attached. Then she put the paper down and waited. What followed was not, technically, the diplomatic equivalent of an explosion. It was more like the moment just before one, that specific quality of stillness where everyone present has registered that something has changed, irreversibly, and is still processing what that means. The Dravari delegation, all 7 of them, were making a sound I had not heard before. The Pholosi representative had gone entirely still, which for a species that communicates primarily through movement meant they had effectively gone mute. One of the smaller delegations, I believe it was the Vethrak, though I am not certain, had begun a quiet internal argument that their translator equipment was, unfortunately, broadcasting at low volume to the surrounding seats. Vethrak Ozuun said, with the particular careful tone of a very old diplomat who has just realized he is in unprecedented territory, he would need to call a recess. Portia Wren said that was completely understandable. The recess lasted 6 hours. I spent most of it in the observation gallery's secondary briefing room, listening to 17 different delegations simultaneously insist that this was impossible, illegal, unprecedented, and not how things were done, sometimes all 4 at once. The Accord's legal team arrived in force and spent 4 of those 6 hours confirming what everyone already suspected. Article 77 was real, the notice was properly filed, and there was, technically, nothing to be done about it except wait out the 90 days. What no one was saying out loud, but everyone was thinking, was the question that made the next 6 hours feel like they lasted 6 years. If humanity withdrew from the Valorum Accord, and then shared that audit with every civilization in the galaxy, what exactly would happen to the Accord's authority? What happened to 11 years of Kethis corridor negotiations? What happened to the 43 civilizations who had built their foreign policy around the assumption that the process worked, when a species with 60 years of membership had just demonstrated, with documented evidence, that it often didn't? I found Vethrak, myself. I was there, obviously, standing at the observation window, looking out at the docking arms of Valoris Prime. And I remember thinking that I had spent 400 years believing diplomacy was the most sophisticated thing intelligent life had ever produced. I was beginning to reconsider. The recess ended not because anyone had found a solution, but because Vethrak Ozuun had spent 6 hours being told by 42 different delegations that he needed to do something, and he had eventually concluded that doing something meant reconvening the session and finding out what exactly humanity actually wanted. Because here is the thing about a negotiation tactic that nobody teaches you in 400 years of diplomatic observation school. And yes, that is a real institution. I attended it. The tuition was unreasonable. The most powerful opening move is not a threat. It is not a demand. It is not even an ultimatum. The most powerful opening move is a door left open at a very specific angle, where everyone in the room can see the light coming through it, but nobody can quite tell where it leads. Humanity had not slammed a door. They had opened one, and every civilization in that hall spent the recess staring at it. When the session reconvened, Vethrak Ozuun, visibly composed in the way that very experienced people become visibly composed when they are privately in freefall, invited the human delegation to continue. Portia Wren said pleasantly that she appreciated the opportunity. She then introduced Reiko Tanaka, who lifted the geological formation data case onto the presentation surface, opened it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment, and began what turned out to be a 2-hour presentation that I can only describe as the most politely devastating thing I have ever watched one species do to a room full of others. It was not the audit alone. The audit had been the announcement. What Reiko Tanaka presented was the proposal. And the proposal was, I need you to understand the elegance of this, because I am still thinking about it, not a replacement for the Valorum Accord. It was a repair manual. Every identified failure point in the Accord's operational structure had a corresponding suggested fix. Every resolution pathway that had historically stalled had an alternative routing mapped alongside it. The binding arbitration timeline, which under current Accord rules could theoretically extend to 40 years for sufficiently complex disputes, and had been redesigned with hard limits, mandatory escalation triggers, and what Reiko Tanaka described, with very little expression, as a presumption of resolution, meaning that if the process failed to produce a decision within the established window, the default outcome would automatically favor the party that had been waiting longest. The Dravari delegation made a sound like a sustained power surge. The Vethrak representative stood up and then sat back down. One of the Philosi observers began moving in a rapid sequence that their translator identified, after a 3-second delay, as extreme agitation followed immediately by what might be interpreted as reluctant admiration. Babatunde Ose, standing at the edge of the presentation area with his hands folded and the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition go exactly according to plan, caught my eye at one point purely by accident, I believe, or possibly not, and gave the smallest nod I have ever seen a human produce. It communicated, with remarkable efficiency, something along the lines of, "Yes, we know this is a lot. No, we are not sorry. Please keep watching." The proposal also addressed the Kethis corridor directly. Not as a special case, not as a priority exception, but as a demonstration model. Humanity had, in the 3 years they spent auditing the Accord, quietly done something else as well. Drago Vasic, who looked up from his reading device for the first time in 4 hours when this section was presented, had apparently spent considerable time in the Kethis corridor region itself, speaking to residents of the disputed systems, reviewing local economic data, mapping the actual daily operational conflicts that 11 years of high-level negotiation had failed to resolve because it had been focused almost entirely on territorial principle rather than practical function. The corridor was not, it turned out, primarily a territorial dispute. It was a logistics dispute wearing a territorial dispute as a costume. The 4 civilizations involved needed the corridor for different reasons at different times in their respective trade cycles, and those cycles only overlapped in conflict about 30% of the year. A rotating access framework, with guaranteed priority windows and a joint maintenance obligation, would resolve the actual problem almost entirely, while leaving the territorial question technically open but operationally irrelevant. 11 years, 46 sessions. The answer had been a scheduling system. I want to say that the room erupted. It did not erupt. What happened was quieter and, in many ways, more significant than eruption. The delegations of the 4 civilizations directly involved in the Kethis dispute were looking at each other with an expression I can only describe as the interstellar equivalent of 2 people who have been arguing about which direction to go for an hour, discovering they were in the same building the whole time. The look was not quite embarrassment, not quite relief. It was the specific expression of beings who have just realized they were solving the wrong problem and are still deciding how they feel about that. Thelok Van, who had by this point abandoned any pretense of neutral procedural management, asked Portia Wren a direct question. He asked whether the human delegation's withdrawal notice was contingent on the Council's response to these proposals. Portia Wren said no. The room moved again. That particular flavor of no, clean, unhurried, without qualification, landed differently than a yes would have. A yes would have been leverage. Everyone understood leverage. A no meant something else entirely, and it took several seconds for the implications to fully propagate through 43 delegations simultaneously. Portia Wren continued. The withdrawal notice was not a bargaining chip. The notice was real. The timeline was real, and if the Council chose not to engage with the proposals, humanity would withdraw on schedule, publish the audit in full, and leave the Accord to reach its own conclusions. She was not here to threaten anyone. She was here because the process they had all agreed to was failing the people it was supposed to serve, and that was not, in the human delegation's assessment, something that should continue for another 7 years, while everyone filled out the correct forms. Then she said something that I have thought about regularly in the time since. She said that the Valorum Accord was genuinely the greatest diplomatic achievement in the history of the galaxy, and that the human delegation believed that and meant it, and that was precisely why they were not willing to watch it calcify into something that protected its own procedures more than it protected the civilizations. Those procedures were designed to serve. Thelok Van was quiet for a long moment, not the processing quiet of someone searching for a response, the quiet of someone who has just heard a thing said plainly that has needed saying for a very long time. What happened over the next 4 days would require its own documentation to capture fully. The short version is this. The Council did not immediately adopt the human proposals. What they did was something arguably more significant. They voted for the first time in the Accord's 700-year history to formally suspend normal deliberation procedures and enter what the Accord's founding charter called, in a clause that had never previously been invoked, an extraordinary review state. It required a 2/3 majority to trigger, and had been placed in the charter as a theoretical emergency measure by founders who apparently suspected, with some prescience, that the system they were building might someday need to examine itself. It passed with 39 votes out of 43. The 4 civilizations involved in the Kethis corridor dispute, without waiting for the formal review outcome, submitted a joint request to pilot the rotating access framework on a provisional basis. The request was processed, under emergency procedures, in 72 hours. A resolution that had been accumulating sessions for 11 years was operationally implemented in 3 days. The Filosi representatives submitted a formal statement of support that their translation team rendered into standard accord notation as overdue and obvious, which I suspect lost something in translation, but conveyed the essential sentiment. Humanity's withdrawal notice remained on file throughout. Portia Ren attended every review session. She brought Reiko Tanaka, who brought more documents. Fen Calloway continued writing things down by hand, and I eventually asked him why, and he said that he found digital records had a way of disappearing when they became inconvenient, and that paper had a more reliable relationship with accountability. I wrote that down myself, which he seemed to appreciate. The extraordinary review concluded 14 months later, with a restructured framework that retained the Accord's core principles while implementing most of the human proposals, modified through a process that was, notably, significantly faster than anything the Accord had managed in recent memory, because everyone involved was operating with the awareness that the review had a deadline, and that deadlines, it turned out, produced decisions. On the final day of the review, Thelok Van formally acknowledged receipt of the human delegation's withdrawal notice and asked whether the delegation wished to amend, extend, or retract it. Portia Ren looked at Babatunde Osei. He looked back at her. This exchange lasted approximately 4 seconds and communicated, as best I could interpret, an entire conversation about whether this had gone the way they hoped, and whether the result was good enough, and whether they believed it would hold. Fen Calloway wrote something. Drago Vasic had put the reading device away, which I noticed. Portia Ren told Thelok Van that the human delegation wished to retract the withdrawal notice and recommit to the Accord under the new framework. Thelok Van said that the retraction was accepted and the recommitment was noted for the record. He then paused, in the particular way of someone who is about to say something that is not in the script, and said that he would also like to note for the record that the human delegation had performed a considerable service to the Accord and its member civilizations, at some apparent diplomatic risk to themselves, and that the Council's appreciation was formally and sincerely extended. Portia Ren said, with the same unhurried calm she had carried into the hall 14 months earlier, that they were happy to help. I stayed on Valoris Prime for 3 more weeks after the review concluded, which I told my colleagues was for documentation purposes, and which was actually because I needed time to sit with what I had observed before I tried to write any of it down. I am a diplomatic observer. I have 4 centuries of experience. I have a professional obligation to maintain analytical distance from the events I document. I will tell you, with full acknowledgement that this represents a departure from professional standard, that watching humanity walk into the most complex diplomatic structure in the galaxy, hand everyone in the room a mirror, and then politely wait to see what they did with it, was the most extraordinary thing I have observed in 400 years of this work. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They did not perform. They showed up with evidence, a proposal, and a 90-day notice, and they trusted the rest of the galaxy to be capable of looking at itself honestly, which is, if you think about it, either the most dangerous assumption you can make in interstellar politics, or the most optimistic. I have decided it was both, and I have decided that is what made it work. The Valorum Accord's revised framework has been in operation for 6 years now. The Kethis corridor has had 0 unresolved access conflicts in that period. The average resolution timeline for Accord disputes has dropped by 63%. 3 previously non-member civilizations have submitted provisional membership applications, citing the restructured framework specifically. Humanity remains a provisional member. I asked Portia Ren once, at a reception on the final evening of the review, why they had never upgraded to full membership in 60 years, and she said something I have been thinking about since. She said that provisional status required them to prove their value continuously, rather than rely on accumulated standing, and that they found that preferable. I did not have an immediate response to that. I am not sure I have one now. What I do have is this: 400 years of observation, and the first note I have ever written in my personal record rather than my professional one, which reads simply, "Do not underestimate a species that does its homework." I have underlined it twice. I think that was warranted.